Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the ISAS-US conference titled The City and Environmental History in Colonial and Post-Colonial South Asia. This is a collaboration between the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and the University of Southampton, UK. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate if you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via this chat to the chairperson. The questions will be collected for the panelists to answer. I now invite Professor Ian Talbot, Director of the Center for Imperial and Post-Colonial Studies and Professor in History of Modern South Asia, US, to deliver the opening remarks. Prof. Talbot, please.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all the participants, the presenters. It's probably a case of good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, such as the world in which we are operating at the moment online. But it's a good opportunity to actually bring people together online and to perhaps compensate for the lack of opportunities for research and for in-person interaction because of the pandemic. This particular event is attempting to explore and encourage intersections between urban and environmental history. This is an area which scholars have noted for some time. The city is often absent in environmental histories and studies of the colonial and post-colonial period. So this event is an opportunity to see how there could be intersections between urban and environmental history. In order to be able to do this, we brought together people that have expertise across a chronological range and also across the South Asia region. And this, again, is something which is often lacking in studies of environmental history. They just tend to focus on one particular country. And when we were putting together this event, one of the aims was certainly to see if we could include as much as possible of the South Asia region. One other introductory remark, it's important, although the conference is called The City, we're actually looking more at the urban and urban development and urban hinterlands rather than just great cities, although there will be references, of course, to major South Asian cities in these presentations. Plans are well underway for an edited volume, more of which I will share in my concluding remarks. I hope that in addition to producing a volume, this event may help to encourage further collaborations between colleagues, sharing in the panels, and also to encourage collaborations at an institutional level. As someone who's visited National University of Singapore and ISAS on a number of occasions, probably going back longer than I would like to admit to now, probably 30 years or more, I've always greatly gained from interactions of this kind, and particularly the encouragement of interdisciplinarity, which I think is a very important feature of the activities, certainly of NUS. So I hope that there could be opportunities coming out of this event for further collaborations between colleagues, and that this is not the end of the connections between ISAS and Institute and the Center for Imperial and Post-Colonial Studies, but actually the beginning of it, and in a formal sense. Finally, I would just like to thank all those people who, as I say, are taking out time in difficult circumstances to make presentations today, and also to work to what is going to be quite a tight timeline, as we'll hear at the end of the conference for actually putting together papers and writing them up in a form for publication. I realize we've got a very busy day coming up in terms of panels, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to. So I'm not going to take up any more time now in these introductory remarks, but just once more, thank everyone for the hard work in putting this event together, and looking forward to what I'm sure are going to be some very interesting and thought-provoking presentations during the course of the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Talbot. We will now commence with our first panel titled Colonial South Asian Cities and Environment. We are delighted to have with us the following panelists: Professor Ian Talbot, Professor Manjari Kamath, Professor at the Department of History and Associate Dean, Humanities, University of Mumbai, India, and Professor Tahir Kamran, Professor at the Department of Liberal Arts, Bacon House National University, Lahore, Pakistan. Chairing this panel is Dr. Priti Puspa Mishra, lecturer in History, University of Southampton. Dr. Mishra, please.
Thanks, Vinny. So we are ready to start the panel. As we've already sort of told you, the panel will consist of these 3 papers, and because we have one speaker missing, we have a little bit of extra time, so the panelists can take up to 20 minutes to present, and I will let you know when you're at 15 minutes so that you can start winding down your talk. And if there are any questions that the audience has, please put them in the chat, and Vinny will be keeping track of those questions, and we will have questions at the end of the papers. So Professor Talbot, over to you.
Thank you, Priti. So in this presentation, I'm going to be looking at an aspect of urban history dealing with partition, the partition of the subcontinent in 1947, and seeing some of the ways in which perhaps partition history and the issues which are coming out of that could help to establish linkages perhaps with environmental history. Urban history, partition history, and environmental history have all grown as major areas of academic scholarship in the last 2 to 3 decades. Many of the things that they talk about are common to these different subfields of South Asian history, but they haven't really been in conversation with each other. And I think that that is important to try and see ways in which these conversations could be begun. So in the first part of my presentation, I'm going to be looking at some of the perhaps common historiographical trends in partition history and South Asian environmental history, and see similarities in terms of their concerns. Then I'm going to move on from that to very briefly sketch out perhaps areas where there could be intersections between environmental and partition history, before finally looking at the Lahore case study and seeing the ways in which some of these intersections might be able to be addressed and how they could help these different disciplines or subfields of urban history and of environmental history come together. So I'm looking at common historiographical trends, and what is coming out, I think, of both partition history and also environmental history is a questioning of periodization. Initially, when these fields developed, they had quite a clear periodization. Partition marked a great watershed, a great divide in the history of the subcontinent. And also, of course, people writing in the early phases of environmental history in South Asia saw the colonial period as a major watershed and divide. And that this was the time in which much environmental damage was sort of done in terms of exploitation of forests, for example, but also controlling management of water systems. And that this was a great sort of watershed that really existed. Recent research, however, but in both fields of environmental history and partition history, have begun to talk about continuities and have begun to talk about the ways in which, despite some important discontinuities, we have to look in longer term trends and to see linkages between pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial histories as far as these fields are concerned. So you can see it coming together there, a possibility then in terms of continuities and discontinuities. Both of these subfields of South Asian history have also been talking about scale and space, the extension of environmental history from peripheral regions. The mirror image of this in terms of looking at partition history, not just in terms of a narrow chronological period, but also looking at it in terms of areas outside of those which were apparently most affected by the division, and seeing long-term ripple effects of partition. The furthest reaches of partition, some people have been talking about. So you can see similarities there. And you can also see, I think, for both partition history and also environmental history, growing links with South Asian social history. Environmental history, looking at, as one of our speakers did in the publication, at the Bengal Delta, and the ways in which society was affected by environmental changes there. Work on refugee communities and in cities like Calcutta, Delhi, Lahore, Amritsar, my own work. There's many connections there with social history in South Asia. So you can see how, despite apparent differences in environmental history and in partition history, there are common grounds of interest. And some of these intersections are quite obvious. Migration histories is one of them. Sunil Amrith, Crossing the Bay of Bengal, a very important work, looks at migrants as agents of environmental transformation. So that, and certainly migration histories of partition often have the environment in the background, if not in the foreground of their study. So that the ways in which resettlement took place, I think, is very important in terms of these different fields of environmental and partition history. And of course, this could be taken up to date. There's been studies of the loss of forest cover in the Mansara district of Pakistan as a result of Afghan refugee camps being established there between 1979 and 1988, with demands for timber, heating, cooking, sort of construction. So you can see how refugees, migration and resettlement do actually have important environmental repercussions. Another area, perhaps of intersection, is that of hazard and inequalities. Much of the writing on partition is about breaking down the universalized view of the refugee experience and showing the refugee experience is very differentiated on the basis of caste, class, gender, region, and that certain groups were able to adapt more readily because of social capital that they possessed than others in terms of this process of resettlement. Looking at environmental inequalities and hazards, there's been a lot of literature produced across a range of periods and countries, which again talk about differential vulnerabilities to environmental hazard, whether it's flooding, whether it's pollution, different classes of people, and particularly, of course, the poor. And here you might make a connection with the urban poor and say that these groups are more vulnerable than perhaps others are. So those are, I think, are some of the ways in which intersections could be made. Looking at Lahore itself, why would it be a good case study for looking at these intersections between environmental history and partition studies? Obviously, as a borderland city, it received large influx of refugees. 2/5 of Lahore's population was recorded in the 1950s as being migrant refugee population. So you can see how migration and refugee influx is very important there. Also, of course, Lahore, because of the violence, because of the unexpected impact of partition, underwent a demographic transformation with the movement out of the Hindu and Sikh population, which made up over 1/3 of the city. You can see from this slide of the Shalami area of Lahore that it was a very mixed community before partition. So there was an exit of Hindu and Sikh population and an influx of the Muslim population. And this counts for the demographic transition. These people didn't move necessarily because they wanted to. They moved in dire circumstances of considerable destruction and violence because of the violence, which really began in Lahore in March 1947 and continued after August 1947, really up until about beginning of October time. And one of the environmental hazards resulting from this violence, and there's a report in the Civil and Military Gazette, one of the leading newspapers, of the violence in June of 1947, well before the August date of independence. There was a great deal of physical destruction, and this had an impact on blockages of drains, flooding within the city. To give you an idea of the level of physical destruction, I'm just going to show you this slide. Sometimes said that the level of physical destruction was so great that it looked like these areas had been bombed, and that that was the level of destruction. You can see this is still in the British period, because these are British soldiers who are walking amidst the rubble. So that there are going to be short-term environmental problems as a result of this level of destruction. And we're talking about 6,000 buildings in the walled city being either completely demolished, like the one in the picture, or being damaged and rendered very structurally unstable. And that, I think, is an important environmental consequence, as we see, and also links in with the notion of differential environmental hazards. it was poorer refugees who ended up, because they had nowhere else to live, in having to survive in damaged buildings. So then, what were the immediate environmental consequences of partition for the city of Lahore? Well, obviously, increased risks of flooding and disease because of the blockage of drainage systems, because of the fact, as we'll see, new urban developments sprung up in areas which were vulnerable to flooding from the River Ravi, the main river flowing through Lahore. Disease, obviously, in the sense of cholera, for example, which people brought with them. There was also the monsoon and building collapses. Each year, for the first 3 years or so after partition, there are reports in the local press, Civil and Military Gazette, Dawn newspaper, of building collapses, because buildings had been made very structurally unsound because of the violence leading up to partition. They were overcrowded with refugees, and there was the risk of collapsing. In 1948, on the anniversary of partition, 18 Muslim refugees from Delhi died in a building collapse in Lahore. And there was a mob that went and tried to wreck the sort of the refugee office afterwards in anger. The following week, 2 more people were killed in building collapses. And in one of those instances, the local press recorded that there was people who had been evacuated from a building which looked like it was on the point of collapse. They had nowhere else to live. So they went back into the building, evading the police pickets. And then they were killed when the building did collapse. Even in July 1950, 500 dangerous buildings had to be demolished because of this danger of collapse in intense monsoon rains and their impact on structurally unsound buildings. So that there is also, of course, irregular and planned spatial development. How were all of these refugees accommodated? The more fortunate ones may have already had people from business connections or family connections. Some ended up in the Walton refugee camp in Lahore. Others occupied these dangerous buildings. There was irregular sort of encroachments, as they were called, as people basically squatted and established temporary shelters, which became more longer-term developments. This, of course, was happening at the same time that the city authorities were having to plan development in the city. But some of this development either occurred in areas which were vulnerable to flooding from the River Ravi, or they created an expansion of the city moving outwards in a way that, without an integrated transport policy, has ultimately sort of encouraged the kind of growth which, until very recently, when there had been attempts with the metro bus, for example, but until very recently have encouraged a kind of development which is very much based on private transport, not public transport, with all of the pollution consequences arising from that. Though it's not just cars that create pollution and the smog which besets Lahore on a regular basis in the so-called 5th season, really from November to February onwards. So these developments, and I'm just going to put up a slide relating to one of these developments. These were planned developments, but often this is the Shadbagh development, which was a development that had begun shortly before partition, but was expanded because of migration into the city from refugees and others afterwards. But throughout the 1950s, this development was very vulnerable to flooding from the Ravi River, despite building a large embankment, which was actually breached in 1955 floods. So it wasn't flood protection that enabled this development to cease flooding from the Ravi River, but the actual change of the course of the river itself. The area today is still subject to flooding, and I think it may link in with one of our later presentations. This is the Shadbagh during a recent flooding area. It's today not the Ravi River which is causing the flooding, but what is sometimes now called pluvial flooding. That is flooding due to excessive rainfall resulting from climate change, and also the inability of the local drainage systems, partly because of encroachments, to actually deal with the volume of water. So flooding of a different kind than perhaps in the 1950s, but nonetheless showing you how these long-term legacies of post-partition housing settlements can still have these environmental problems today. The aspects, I just want to very quickly in the last two slides mention two other aspects relating to the post-partition planning. The first one, as you can see on this slide, is that the decline in greenery, as it's called, in the city. Lahore was always known as the city of gardens. It's now become a concrete heat island in many ways because of the expansion of the city, dramatic expansion since partition, concreting not just in building construction, but in building flyovers and various road systems, all of which, of course, are designed to deal with traffic congestion, which is in part the result of the way in which the city has expanded, lacking, until at least very recently, any integrated transport system. So cutting down of trees in the city to make way for road widening, for development of plazas, for these new road systems. This has all had an effect. And in the context of climate change, obviously is a major problem in environmental terms. The city itself, of course, as for many cities in the north of the Indian subcontinent, and I'll just finish on this slide note, has suffered from poor air quality. Delhi, of course, has suffered very much from poor air quality. This is not just due to traffic, but also to industrial development and the development alongside residential areas of industrial units. And I think that there are other factors as well: stubble burning, brick kiln industry. We could go into detail about all the factors for the air quality decline, but some of these again are long-term consequences of the kind of development that occurred at partition. And to finally sort of bring all this together, I think just as in the immediate post-partition period, it was often the poorer classes who were most vulnerable to environmental hazards, then it's probably, in many senses, the poorer classes who are today most vulnerable to the toxic air quality and other environmental hazards, which are not unique by any means to the Lahore, but which are common across, as I say, the north of the Indian subcontinent. I think I'll finish on that point because I see time is moving on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. We'll quickly move on to Professor Tahir Kamran's talk, which is about 19th century Lahore art instruction and the category of the natural.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm enormously grateful to the organizers of the conference, Institute of South Asian Studies and University of Southampton. So University of Southampton, I vividly remember having spent a few months there, and that was a great learning experience for me, and a very able guidance of Professor Ian Talbot. Since Ian and I attempted a book on Lahore, so it's really very exciting to give a novel perspective on that historical city of classical reputation. When I was just applying my mind on this environmental issues concerning Lahore, particularly during the British period, I was reminded of one talk by a renowned painter who painted Lahore. Lahore prior to partition, Professor Ijaz Anwar, and he talked about the railway network, which started in 1859, and when that railway line was being laid out between Lahore and Sheikhupura, it passed through the mausoleum of Jahangir, Nuruddin Jahangir, a great Mughal emperor. So that was probably the first encroachment of its kind on the natural asset that Lahore had. Then I think the tormentor-in-chief or destroyer-in-chief, so far as Lahore is concerned, was our last chief minister, Mr. Shehbaz Sharif, who was responsible for felling no less than 6,000 trees over the course of last 10 years or so, just to widen the roads. Similarly, in order to widen the road from Lahore to Wagah border, a part of Shalimar Garden had been destroyed. So all these environmental hazards have greater consequences, and we are, the residents of Lahore, we are bearing those consequences with heavy heart. So my presentation, which is work in progress, is a shift from a devotional to natural in 19th century Lahore's art instruction. The way Lockwood Kipling, during the 19th century, when he was asked to set up Muir School of Art, so the whole movement got underway, which transformed the epistemic trajectory in Lahore and in Lahore's art instruction in particular. During that century, 19th century, and particularly last quarter of the 19th century, new responses to nature profoundly impacted the creative arts. Painters, sculptors, and poets alike drew inspiration from their immediate natural surroundings and the world beyond. So in this presentation, I'll examine the growing impact of the natural environment on art instruction through a case study of Lahore's renowned Mayo School of Arts. Mayo School of Arts was one of the four major School of Arts and Designs. That was set up, that was established in 1875, and that acquired obviously international reputation. Traditionally in Punjab, the articulation of artistic potential through sculpture and modeling had been devoted towards making of artifacts for temples and shrines. And the relationship between artisan and nature was mediated through extraterrestrial or a religious medium, a medium of spirituality, one may say. So interestingly, artisans engaged in the construction of these architectural monuments had a strong spiritual allegiance with those buildings and also with those individuals in the memory of whom those buildings were built, like Sufi shrines. If they're building a Sufi shrine, or someone is sculpting the image of god and goddesses, which would be put in the temple for the praying purposes, that will emanate, or that will come into existence as a result of the devotion that one finds with the shrine or with the temple. And those artisans who were sculpting it, who were making it, they had a special relationship with the artifacts that he is making, or he is, he is manufacturing. If I don't know whether this this expression is right or not. Those skills were bequeathed from generation to generation in the days when occupational mobility was considered as a taboo, because prior to the establishment of Mayo School of Arts in Lahore, Lahore and its surrounding areas, that expertise of sculpting or carpenting or artisanal practices of various kinds, it was transferred from generation to generation in a Ghrana tradition. Same holds true for the music. There's a Patiala Ghrana, there's a Gavalia Ghrana, there's Sham Churasi Ghrana. So that expertise, particularly art expertise, was transferred from generation to generation within a family. So, our former friend, Mr. Nadeem Umar, described it as a shift from a Ghrana tradition to a Karkhana tradition, the way Lockwood Kipling started this practice through Mayo School of Art, and by imparting special training to the artisanal classes. So Masons had been sculpting the images of gods and goddesses, a practice that was quite widespread after the reform movements like Arya Samaj, because my own research revealed that in the later part of the 19th century, there was a mushroom growth of temples in Lahore, and those temples involved a lot of artisanal classes in the construction of beautiful temples, and all the artifacts or all the sculptures that conjured up into existence the images of gods and goddesses. And that devotional allegiance that they had with those gods and goddesses was quite tangible. With the coming of Arya Samaj in particular, that religious fervor translated into the construction of temples. So that led Orientalists and those people like Lockwood Kipling to that believe that this devotional allegiance with gods and with shrines and with temples is not only irrational or irrational. This is also superstitious. So any sort of a superstition is not helpful in breeding rational practices or rational ideologies. So archival sources of the New School of Arts highlight this shift in the paradigm in the production of artwork. Kipling impressed on his pupils to draw things which had visual presence. So this difference that Lockwood Kipling tried to create, it involved eye, mind, and hand coordination. So because all rational artisanal practices involve these three faculties, you draw something or you sculpt something that you can see. And then the image of that can be processed through your mind, because that is very, very important for rational articulation of artisanal practices. And then you use hand in order to make it. He used to instruct his pupils to go to Akbari Gate and sit in front of Masjid Wazir Khan, that was called as Ornament of Lahore, and try to draw, particularly all the subtle ingredients in its architectural pattern, like floral designs, the background of Masjid Wazir Khan. So that's how the shift occurred from the sculpting or the drawing of or conception of gods and goddesses from the objects of nature. So that is what that shift is clearly highlighted through the archival sources housed in the National College of Arts. Similarly, River Ravi became very important, particularly for poets. Iqbal's poem Darya Ravi Ke Kinare, that is very, very important, and description of Ravi as a lifeline for Lahore is very prominent. Sadly, River Ravi has been reduced to a drain, and now current government is trying to just revive it. Let's see how far would it be successful. So when in the Muir School of Arts, course outline prepared for the students in 1875-76, drawing and modeling of natural objects became compulsory subject. So you have to engage with nature. That will emphasize the human relationship with nature, objects of nature, no mediation of any religious devotion. So the contact between a man and the natural object itself directly through eye and mind, and the expression, artistic expression, will be through the instrument of hand. So that was introduced here in a subtle way that yielded result, because later on the legatees of Lockwood Kipling, like Bhairam Singh, they were trained in this tradition, and we saw that that articulation of natural or the drawing of natural objects became the strong point of those people who passed out of Mayo School of Arts. So now, when when I was just looking at those archival sources, I was just intrigued to know where that tradition came from. How come Lockwood Kipling, who was an artist, how come his involvement with nature and nature became tangible enough for all of us to appreciate and to see. His training at South Kensington School of Art and Design, and the way the South Kensington School of Art and Design was constructed, and all the notions and concepts underpinning the construction or the setting up of South Kensington School of Art and Design answered this question. South Kensington School of Art and Design came into being as a result of the art exhibition that happened in London in 1851, and later on DSA was formed. DSA was Department of Science and Arts. These two events created an environment, or created a phenomenon which transpired into the creation of South Kensington School of Art and Design, and the conceptualization of nature in that school was derived from two giant Germans, Immanuel Kant and Goethe. And these two people had quite an influence on Lockwood Kipling, along with the training that he got from South Kensington School of Art and Design. But more so, what was more important was his inspiration that he drew from John Ruskin. John Ruskin was a great advocate of nature, and he and obviously Lockwood Kipling was a great admirer of John Ruskin. So all these traditions synthesized, and they found a great admirer in the form of Lockwood Kipling, who came to Bombay, and then he was posted to Lahore, and in Lahore the whole tradition or whole movement was started, where nature was conceptualized and it was artistically expressed. So that was one movement which became quite robust as time, with the passage of time. And other movement that was coterminous, that was simultaneous to Lockwood Kipling's asserting himself as an advocate of nature, was by Colonel Holroyd, Dr. Leitner, and Muhammad Hussain Azad. They tried to transform the literary tradition in Lahore by bringing in a romantic natural poetry, where they transformed the literary tradition, which the new thematics were introduced, the new style of poetry was introduced, which had environmental themes, which covered and addressed environmental themes like rain, Barkharot, similarly about Hubbul Watan or patriotism. So particularly Barkharot, and the format and the forms of poetry were changed. And and one influence which that initiative by Holroyd, Leitner, and Muhammad Hussain Azad took, one great consequence was the emergence of a poet like Iqbal, who started his poetry by addressing or by bringing in the objects of nature like Himala. His first poem that is part of his poetry compendium is on Himala. Similarly, or Gulhari, Shama or Parwana, all these are the objects of nature. And later on, subsequently, he also wrote a wonderful poem on Ravi. So that's how the objects of nature's engagement with the artists and poets. So it formed the cultural formation. It made a cultural formation, and that cultural formation became our great asset. Despite the fact that whatever post-colonials say, I must say that that was a great leap forward. I'll stop on that. My work is in progress, and I'm really enjoying digging out material on that and trying to understand the subtleties of that environmental issues, and particularly how nature was brought into as an epistemic theme here in Lahore in the 19th century. Thank you very much. I hope I made some sense.
Thank you, Professor Kamran. That was really interesting. We'll move on to the last talk of this session, which is by Professor Manjari Kamath. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. May I start?
Yes.
Yeah. So good afternoon all, and it's such a pleasure to participate in this conference, and I thank the organizers at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and University of Southampton for inviting me to make a presentation at this particular conference. Now, with regard to the theme of the conference and the presentation that I'm going to make, which is titled Building with a Conscience, Heritage, Design and Urban Space in Bombay. Right at the outset, I would like to clarify that my work is more in the field of urban history rather than environmental history. But the precise objective of this particular conference is to initiate a dialogue. And from that perspective, I have made a small attempt, but I wish to improvise and do more research for the writing of the final paper. Now, in this presentation, I'm focusing on the 19th and 20th century Bombay. And the paper is seeking to engage with the urban history and built environment of colonial Bombay in an effort to understand the vision which shaped the building of structures, many of which are today a part of the city's heritage. A common thread I find which underpinned some of these endeavors was sensitivity to the city's environment. More important, I feel, is the precinct or open spaces around these built structures were crucial to the architect's design. The architect factored in the tropical climate, relied in many cases on the indigenous material and the local craftsmen who used their skill, which not only reflected aesthetic sensibilities, but also protected these buildings from damage caused by climatic factors. It placed the comfort of those who would inhabit the buildings and the function of these buildings that they were meant to serve. So essentially, this presentation will explore certain specific features of the architectural styles in colonial Bombay in the late 19th and early 20th century to illustrate this. there were also efforts which were made in the wake of the bubonic plague, which I see as a significant turning point, at the turn of the century, that is the 1896 bubonic plague, after which there is a lot of discourse about what needs to be done, for the urban poor. And there is a shift after that in terms of the public health policies, but also in terms of the government initiatives to have affordable, clean housing for the urban poor. So there are developments which take place after the bubonic plague. And of course, after independence, I will delve into a little bit in terms of the contemporary, the recent years, and what is happening to the built environment of the city. So broadly speaking, I will, I'm dividing it into briefly the historical background, to the built environment during the colonial period, and finally the challenges, which the city is facing in the last couple of decades. Now, in terms of the historical background, we know that the 19th century in many ways was a takeoff period for the city of Bombay, which by 1872 emerges as the second city of the British Empire. So from the time when the English East India Company gets to the Seven Islands, to a time when it is a major industrial city and a commercial. 19th century, with regard to the built environment of Bombay, we see drastic changes, where you have the transportation, and the infrastructure is planned. The waterworks are planned in that, in that particular century. The educational institutions, banking, and all this urbanization and developments take place in the 19th century. After which the century ends with a major crisis. And then, of course, I see the early 20th century, which is the colonial period, where there are severe challenges which are faced in terms of health and the infrastructure, and what is done to grapple with them, and the post-independence. So coming to the built environment of the city, I've divided it into certain templates or certain themes to illustrate what I'm trying to say here. One is basically, if we look at the educational institutions, and in educational institutions, even if we take the example of the University of Bombay buildings, which are today a part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the major buildings, the heritage buildings, were built by the British, the architect Sir George Gilbert Scott. So if we were to look at those designs of these educational institutions like the university and others, but particularly focusing on the university buildings, we find that although, this was a neo-Gothic style, the architect never visited the city, but the vision, the thought which went into it is basically that while you have the arches and the stained glasses and typical features of the Gothic designs, care was taken to see, the way the university buildings are built, to ensure that the monsoon, or the rains do not enter these buildings, in the sense that there were these huge balconies on, all sides of the buildings, to protect the interiors from the Bombay monsoon. But at the same time, if one were to sit in these buildings during the summer season, then care was also taken that the sunlight and the glare doesn't come in. There were high ceilings. So there is Burma teak, which is used in, for example, the famous fort library buildings. So just to illustrate that care was taken, and sensitivity is shown to the environment and to the climate while these, buildings were being constructed. Whether it's the Convocation Hall or it is the main Rajabai Tower University Library and those buildings. Very important is the wider precinct and the gardens, which has rare species of trees in this whole heritage precinct, which I'm very proud to say is a part of the 2018 award of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Again, the materials which are used are local materials. The craftsmen, the superintending engineers were Indian. And even if you look, Professor Kamran mentioned Lockwood Kipling. So Lockwood Kipling, as the principal of the JJ School of Art, is involved in the building of these magnificent buildings. So the statues which we see are very much the outcome of the work which is done by the students of Lockwood Kipling. Care to show, if we look at the decorative features, the flora, the fauna, the statues also represent the different communities of Western India. And I think those aspects are extremely important while one looks at these educational institutions. Second, thematically, even if we look at the health infrastructure, of that time, then the hospitals which were constructed through public-private partnership, which are again, some are Gothic, but some are Indo-Saracenic architecture, like the King Edward Memorial Hospital, we again find systematic planning. To take an example of central Bombay Parel area, you have that entire area which is planned as a hospice area, with the King Edward Memorial Hospital, with the Indo-Saracenic fusion with the Islamic design, with proper ventilation, courtyards, and these marvelous heritage buildings which exist even today. But in the same precinct, we have the veterinary hospital, we have the children's hospital, the Wadia maternity hospital, as well as later we find the Tata Memorial Hospital, which of course is a later development, but also the Hafkin Memorial, the Hafkin Institute, which at that time was the bacteriological laboratory, and the work which was done by Waldemar Hafkin in discovering the vaccine against plague and cholera. So again, a well-planned development with care taken, not just in the buildings or the built environment, but also in the surrounding. Third template in terms of the built environment I see is the transport infrastructure and planning of the waterworks. Bombay was the first city where the piped water supply started. And here I would like to mention the work of Henry Conybeare, which has been outlined in Professor Mariam Dosel's works, as to how the waterworks were planned, the Vihar Tulsi Tansa waterworks. And along with the waterworks, the stormwater drains, the care which is taken, particularly in what today is South Bombay, and also the transport infrastructure. So even if we were to look at the railway stations, like the Victoria terminus, which is today the CST station, or the suburban railway stations, whether it's Bandra or the Mumbai Central railway station built in those times, they are functional even today. So care is taken with regard to the open spaces, with regard to ventilation, with regard to the high ceilings, with the management of crowds, and at the same time the aesthetic aspect is not compromised. VT again, Victoria's station is again in itself awarded a World Heritage Site status. So this is what I want to kind of convey through the building of the transport infrastructure of colonial Bombay, as well as the waterworks. That these stations, for example, Bombay Central, built by the famous architect Claude Batley, again is a very good example. And anybody who has visited that will understand in terms of how it is the sunlight which is coming through, the architecture of Bombay Central station in such a way that it protects the station, a huge station, from the monsoon, but at the same time, is affording plenty of light without the glare. Fourthly, the museums. The museums, Professor Kamran mentioned the famous art exhibition in London. Now, Bombay sees museums like the Victoria and Albert Museum built, in the 19th century, or in the early 20th century, the Prince of Wales Museum. Now, when the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is later known as the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, is constructed, next to it are the botanical gardens, which today are which is the Jizamata Udyan today. So here again, there is planning where the city museum is in proximity to the botanical gardens and the zoo. And once again, if one visits these museums even today, the Bhaudaji Lad Museum or the Prince of Wales Museum, known as the CSM-VS Museum, one is again struck not just by, let's say, the Indo-Saracenic architectural design of the CSMVS Museum, but also the beautiful gardens and the rare species of trees one finds in them. And here again, I would like, while we are talking of these open spaces, the last segment which I want to talk about here in terms of the built environment of Bombay are the precincts and the open spaces. So whether it is, the Bandra, the Bandra villages or the Kotachi Wadi, but also the Maidans, the open Maidans and the Gymkhanas. The Gymkhanas, the cricket Gymkhanas, which were planned along the Marine Drive, the Hindu Gymkhana, Parsi, Islam Gymkhana, has, the way it is planned is the open spaces on Marine Drive, but also inside the city, where the Oval Maidan, the Azad Maidan, the Cross Maidan, and in central Bombay, the Shivaji Park. So today, of course, I'll come to that part later, but the point I'm trying to make is the built environment and the built heritage or those buildings is given importance, but it's the same amount of importance which is given to the open spaces around these buildings and to the to these huge maidans of Bombay, which today also are a pleasure in terms of walking in those maidans, as well as they are for cricket. The last part, of course, of the talk is the challenges. Now, Bombay begins to face these challenges very much. As I say, the turning point is the bubonic plague of 1896, after which, if you look at government records and the discourse in terms of the Millowners Association reports and newspapers and how the government looks at it, of course, there is panic. And the response is basically that, the urban poor, of course, Professor Talbot spoke about Lahore and, post-partition. But here those concerns come, after 1900, after 1896 plague, to see what can we do about this. So you have a Bombay City Improvement Trust, which is planned on the model of the Glasgow Improvement Trust, whose main aim is to build affordable and clean housing for the urban poor, to open up congested localities, to widen roads. And of course, as Prashant Kidambi's work, or Professor Rajnarayan Chandavarkar, who was my PhD guide, as his work has shown, that although it did to a large extent accomplish many of these aims, more of the time you see that chawls, which is the working class dwellings, more of demolitions was done in comparison to what was built in response to, in terms of the work of the Bombay City Improvement Trust. The two world wars, in terms of Bombay, see demographic pressures. Demographic pressures after First World War, as in terms of the Second World War, you see the population of Bombay increasing, and particularly in the post-partition period. The expert is Professor Talbot. One sees, the population of Bombay spiraling, and how efforts are made in terms of the Bombay Development Department after post-war World War I, and after World War II. Of course, the effort is to reduce the congestion in South Bombay. And the Charles Correa plan of, in the later 20th century sees an effort made in terms of the drawings, that the plan made, because Bombay is north-south, it cannot expand in the east-west direction because of the sea. The idea mooted to form Navi Mumbai or New Bombay and reduce the congestion in South Bombay. I would like to conclude by saying that the challenges faced at that plan has very much remained on paper. A golden opportunity in terms of the mill lands after the 82 strike, has been lost, because much of what was proposed in the plan never happened. What, in terms of providing housing for the workers, in terms of the open spaces, was not done. So with the result, what we find, and I would like to end with this, is right now in Bombay, there is although the city has pioneered heritage legislation in India, right from 1995, and I myself am a member of the, Mumbai Heritage Conservation Committee, so I firsthand see how policy making happens. So there is this constant tussle between heritage conservation and the demands of development and the population rise. Number two, the constant tussle I see between repairing dilapidated buildings or housing societies and redevelopment, as the word which is being used, to suddenly sort of demolish properties and have high rises. A third major concern I want to sort of conclude with, which I'm concerned about, is the seafronts, the beautiful seafronts of Mumbai, whether it's the Marine Drive, the Haji Ali, the Worli Sea Face. I'm seeing that, of course, the coastal road is being built. And although care is being taken, one is worried about the future in terms of the ecological impact of the coastal road and the ecological impact of the metro which is being developed in Bombay. Lastly, of course, the Mithi River and the airport of Bombay and the Bandra Kurla complex as an alternative business district has been built by diverting the flow of the Mithi River. We saw the consequences of this in the record floods which Bombay saw, which had not been seen earlier in 2005, and as recently as the Totke, recent cyclone, the kind of flooding which Bombay saw, and this is just the beginning of the monsoon, we have not seen before. So I think those are, are signals that one has to wake up and address these problems. Of course, with the metro, there was a recent contestation, but thankfully the government has halted the coming of the metro car shed in the R.A. Milk colony, the forests. That has been averted, but we need to be vigilant in the future as well. So I would conclude by saying that, I'm observing that kind of sensitivity which one saw in terms of the planning, with the built environment, the precincts and the open spaces, one hardly sees those kind of spaces, between the kind of haphazard development that Bombay is seeing at present. Whether it is addressing the housing needs of the city is a question mark. Post-textile strike of 1982, we see a gentrification of Mumbai and deindustrialization and a reverse migration with workers going back to the Konkan and the other districts. And lastly, the main worry today is that the open spaces in Bombay are shrinking. And although there are municipal, I'm ending here, although there are municipal laws and heritage legislation to take care of all this, it is a constant contestation. And I finally end by saying that there needs to be collaboration between the policymakers, the urban planners, and civil society, to safeguard the city and the environment for the coming generations. Thank you very much, Preeti, for allowing me those extra minutes. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this really, really interesting talk, Dr. Kamal. And it'd be great if all three speakers could put their cameras on, because we will have questions, and it may be that some of the questions are addressed to more than one of the speakers. So while we wait for questions, and please feel free to put the questions in the chat or raise your hands, and I'll make sure that your questions are read out. So while we wait, I thought I'd have a couple of questions which may kind of address all three of you. One of the kind of threads especially between Professor Kamat's talk and Professor Kamran's talk is a sort of rethinking of how we see colonial intervention into Indians and South Asian space, or South Asian understandings of space, nature, etc. Could you kind of build a little bit on that, and sort of, are you trying to argue against a kind of a tendency to see colonial intervention as entirely negative? And especially for Professor Kamat, these kind of early colonial stories that you told about how the built environment developed, it was really interesting to see how kind of thoughtful it was, especially with regard to material and climate, and how they were both being kind of put in conversation with each other. And I was wondering whether there were actually local conversations about climate that were being engaged with. So who were the actors? Were they simply colonial officials discussing these things and having this kind of foreign designer? Or were there kind of local kind of lower level officials who were also engaged in these conversations? So were there older existing traditions of building within the kind of particular climate of Mumbai that was being taken into account? And again, with Professor Kamran, this shift in thinking about art, was that already in process in Pakistan in some way, where there were kind of discomfort about thinking about just devotion, not to the kind of the environment, the natural, as you say?
Well, with the onset of British rule or colonialism, you know, Punjab was annexed in 1849. And afterwards, there was reorganization. It seems that Lahore was totally reorganized, particularly after 1857. And from 1857 onwards, what I see is that Lahore had virtually become the cultural center of northern India. And because of the institutional development that was taking place. And one of the seminal institution that had been set up was Mayo School of Art. And what Mayo School of Art was doing was introducing a rational, the element of rationality into the conceptualization of art and its articulation. You know, like what I forgot to mention, because whatever the presentation was mostly my notes or my memory, which at times eludes the speaker. So Lockwood Kipling emphasized that while expressing nature, you can deploy geometry and mathematics. So mathematics and geometry was instructed, and that was the most difficult phase for the local artisans to learn it, because they used to learn from their earlier generation through practice. You know, like you know, those kumhars or tirkhans at Punjab villages, they don't learn geometry to make a plow, or to make to make a string cot, you know, charpai, or something like this. So it comes either naturally to them, or by they inherit that technique from that. So so what Lockwood Kipling tried to do was to wave off the medium, and that medium was a devotional medium. Just to try and conceptualize and to look at natural objects rationally and with objectivity, with with objectivity. So the relationship between a person and a natural object should be direct instead of it is mediated through some means, and that means was devotional. That's what I was trying to argue. So that devotional mean was struck down, and this connection was made direct. And if there was something to mediate, it was the rational medium through geometry and mathematics. I hope I have answered.
Thank you.
Right. In response to that, Preeti, what I would like to say here is your first, question was with regard to the colonial interventions. So here I just wanted to clarify that while this sensitivity is seen with regard to many of these buildings which today are part of Mumbai's heritage, we do not see in the sense I'm trying to say that it's not just a binary as it might have appeared, because when it comes to the housing of or the buildings built for the urban poor, especially the textile mill workers, which were known as the chawls, we find that there isn't much kind of attention paid to the climate and the monsoon and all that I have spoken about. And these buildings were built by either private landlords or in some cases by the owners of the textile mills. And constantly we see this discourse between the officials, the government of Bombay, the municipal corporation, and the mill owners association, each one saying that yes, something needs to be done about clean affordable housing, opening up the roads and all, but actually they are saying that the others should do it. So they're saying, the government is saying, well, the mill owners should do it for the workers. The mill owners are saying, maybe the government should do it, and so on. So with the result that the chawls which were built, and there is some work which has been done on it, I myself have worked on it, is mainly, there is, these are just open, they're just one room tenements mainly with very bad ventilation. And there is a lot written by that, even by the medical officers which visit these chawls. So I just sort of wanted to bring that out. And finally, like you said, whether the local level there was input and contribution with regard to what I said. So there was. So even in the building of the university buildings and the others, the actual architect in this particular case, Sir George Gilbert Scott, never visited Mumbai, factored in all this, but the actual people on the spot like Ramchandra Mukund or the surveyor, and the others, obviously had a very big role to play in actually how it was designed. And one evidence I have is basically that in the case of the Senate Hall, which is today known as the Convocation Hall, the original design was different, but eventually that was not done that way. So so from that we know that there were changes which were made. And finally, I would like to even say with the Marine Drive, which is the second largest, Art Deco style architecture in the whole world after Miami, is basically where you see each building having galleries and ventilation, which today in Mumbai you don't find at all. So that's how I would like to respond to this question. So yes, there was input at the local level. Yes.
That's really interesting, especially about Mukund. I mean, I wonder if there's a kind of a whole tradition of architecture that comes out of the local kind of actors and them kind of training more and more people. That is
Yes,
a mix.
and as I mentioned, I mean, even our own students of the Indian students at the JJ School of Art, in terms of the statues which are built on our library building representing different communities, it's actually the students of Lockwood Kipling, but they're all students. And just wanted to flag here that one thing which which was encouraged in those days was competition amongst for the best designs. And the other thing which again gradually is decreasing is the public-private partnership. These buildings were funded by Indian, traders, cotton traders, and so on. So funding came from Indians, but the designs. So it was a public-private partnership. Even the JJ Hospital, I would like to say, post-independence, there's not a single government hospital. But during the colonial times, Jamsetji Jijiboy donates money to build the hospital, which is used even today in the context of the pandemic. Thank you.
Long
Uh,
story.
So, Preeti, I want to ask questions from Mr. Kaman about the shanty towns, Jhampadpatti, what they call, particularly in and around Taj Mahal Hotel. So, is the government of Maharashtra planning to do something about it in order to ameliorate a lot of the poor living there with no amenities at all? Or that is just holding it as a specimen, that Bombay and Delhi is known for all around the world.
Yeah, so Professor Kamran, basically there is a slum rehabilitation scheme. If I were to sort of observe over the last few years, there were these slums and shanties across, on the other side of the railway line. I'm talking about the suburbs within the city. So they are not there now. So what is being done by the government is they are now, as part of the slum rehabilitation scheme, these high rises are coming up. So the builders, in fact, because of the FSI that they get, the inhabitants of the slums are accommodated in these buildings. And of course, some of the floors they can get for the profit. So that scheme is very much there. And Dharavi, the largest slum in Asia, of course, there's a major redevelopment plan for that.
Thank you.
There's a question from Nandini Oza, and she asked, you mentioned local materials in colonial buildings of Mumbai, but also mentioned Burma teak. So the distance from where the material was transported would be good to know. Are there any records of displacement in building these buildings in South Mumbai? So were there other buildings that were kind of brought down? Also, what were the sources of water and power to Mumbai at the time of colonial expansion of buildings?
Right. So very quickly, the Burma teak is mainly used in the main university library building in the ceiling, which thankfully has now also been restored and won another UNESCO award. So I'm very glad that at present a lot of care has been taken to preserve and restore these buildings. But you don't find that in the other, the other buildings when you talk about the teak. But the local materials I spoke about is mainly the Kurla stone. So those are used in much of the architecture in these buildings, and the craftsmen were also local. In terms of the water supply, initially, of course, this piped water supply was not there, but from the mid 19th century. Mainly, it is from the Vihar, Tulsi, and Tansa lakes that water starts coming into the city. As I mentioned, Henry Conebier, who has written a whole report on the sanitary state of the Bombay island. So piped water supply starts coming, and also reservoirs built on Malabar Hill for the population of South Bombay. And since then, of course, more developments have taken place to find alternative supplies, because of the burgeoning population of the city.
Preeti, here I want to add something and that will be in connection with whatever Professor Kamath said, with particular reference to Lahore. And then I will link it up to Mumbai. Sorry, Mumbai. What we have noticed when we were doing our book, Ian and myself, like Lahore railway station, when it was being built, all the raw material was extracted from the havelis and the shrines and the mosques that existed in Lahore during medieval era. So all the raw material was coming from there. Similarly, when Lahore Multan railway line was being laid out, all the material that got around Montgomery district was from the cultural mounds of Harappa. Those were excavated, and all the bricks that were retrieved from there, those bricks were used for laying out that railway line. And the whole modernization of Lahore, that ravaging and ransacking of the medieval monuments was one fallout of it. All big government buildings were built at the expense of the medieval monuments. So, Sultan Thekedar and Rai Bahadur Melaram, and these were Thekedar contractors who used to do this. I'm really interested that Mumbai, since having no medieval history, as this question has already been asked about Burma teak, where that raw material, was transported to Mumbai, and was there any, that's my understanding that with no medieval history of Mumbai, so it must be a great undertaking getting all that raw material from afar to the site of construction, isn't it?
Yeah, so in response to Nandini Oza, and in continuation with what Professor Kamran has said, as I say, this Burma teak we find in this major building. Not, in most of the others, we find the local basalt and the Kudla stone. And I think this would have come by the sea route. In terms of, because I haven't answered that, in terms of the question which Nandini Oza is asking about displacement, I wish to say that the land on which these buildings were built, especially the university buildings, is just these are open spaces, and there was the sea. Okay, later land was reclaimed, so there wasn't any building or anything that was displaced in order to build university buildings, because it was open land. And when it comes to the Marine Drive buildings, the beautiful Art Deco, buildings in South Bombay, that is reclaimed land. So that land was not there. If you look at the older photographs, our university just faces the sea. Sometimes secretly, I wish it was like that, because it's beautiful. But then you have land which is reclaimed, and on that reclaimed land we have these other heritage structure, the Art Deco and all coming up on that. And that again ties up with this conference, because those again are environmental issues about land reclamation in cities like Bombay, where there is no land to exploit. And finally, your question about power. It was the Bombay Electric, it was the BEST, which supplied power to the Bombay Electric Supply and Transport Company.
Which year was it?
This was at the turn of around 1907. So that's when electric. So then you have trams also, which are which use electricity, which is very interesting. Water, of course, as I say, from the later mid-19th to the later 19th century has already started. Electricity is a bit later.
So in Lahore, electricity came in 1914. So it's the gap of 7 years. So. Yeah. Lahore existing on the peripheries, British took full care that the needs of the people are catered to.
Yeah, and here it's electricity and transport. That's why it's called, and the famous Bombay, Mumbai red buses.
Yeah.
The BEST undertaking, I mean, it was written on them. So it's the Bombay Electric Supply and Transport Company, dealing with both electricity and for transport.
Thank you. We have one question from Professor Mehta, who says that, thanks for the interesting talk. She grew up in these spaces in Bombay, and so did I. I went to school in a school which was right by the sea in Mahim. So a quick question that she has is, maybe the planners and architects were sensitive to monsoon temperature, light, and also built on local styles, but weren't these highly elitist structures? And also, these open spaces in Bombay were probably off limits to locals and the poor anyway, and actually still are. So isn't this kind of fairly a story of kind of these elite structures that are built as kind of prestige projects, as opposed to the chawls, that there's a kind of position?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, which is why, as I earlier said, that most of these major structures like university buildings or these huge, railway stations and, the hospitals, etc., definitely we could look at it as, elitist. But on the other hand, if I would also like to say that when it comes to the university library building and the convocation hall, I don't think we can call that elitist, because that is like education for society at large. And so while the structures are imposing, definitely it is the education was open to all, and these buildings, I'm happy to say, are still functional. But and so is the Victoria terminus. I mean, today crowds of, as Preeti says, she's lived here, whether it's Bandra and all, it's ordinary people who every day go through these stations. So while I would say, in response to Ms. Mehta's question, that some of the buildings are elitist, but whether it's the museums, thousands of tourists from all parts of India and the world visit it, the railway stations, the JJ hospital, even today, those who cannot afford going to the super specialty hospitals, they visit the JJ hospital. And coming to the middle classes, of course, the Hindu colony, the Parsi colony, the way they were styled in central Bombay, were again structures which even today, are very, you can see the planning that has gone into it. So what I would like to flag here is the public-private partnership you see in that, yeah, even in the major buildings. And most of them were not elitist. They are used by ordinary people, citizens of Mumbai.
And so this seems to be part of a broader story of 19th century philanthropy, both in England and India. That
yes. Yeah, the only thing is the chawls, unfortunately, where the workers are living, is not taking, one cannot see that the ventilation and what all I spoke about, you don't see that being followed in the dwellings for the working classes. And Claude Batley, the architect, calls them, in fact, he calls them warehouses. And he says, how can people live in these dwellings? And there's a lot of critique and these debates in the Journal of the Indian Institute of Architects. So it would be interesting to kind of go deeper into it, in response to these questions and the discussion.
There's a final question, because we just have a couple more minutes, from Ramla Wahab Salman. And this is a question to the group at large. To touch on, could you please touch on Patrick Geats and the historical moment of his planning ideas in Asia? How does that kind of speak to your particular historical moments and spaces that you've been talking about? Ian, do you want to take that first, or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the issues, in terms of looking at urban development and the environment generally, and the colonial legacy for this, is each city, as we've heard, Mumbai, Bombay, Lahore are very different. They have their different architectural transitions. They have their different cultural transitions, you know, and that is, I think, one of the differential aspects of this. When I was trying to put this whole thing together, you know, looking at environment, urban, colonial, post-colonial context, you know, I was very much aware of the fact that urban spaces are so different. They're different for classes, they're different for regions, you know, that they emerge in different cultural contexts locally. So while we can talk about common trends, you know, across South Asia, from colonialism and its legacies and into the post-colonial period, I think that the particular is still very significant, you know, and that's one of the issues which I would like to stress. It may not directly answer the question, but I think it's important, you know, to bear in mind that we want to look at these big themes and to try and assess them and to see how environment has been influenced by urban growth and development across the last perhaps 150 years in South Asia. We're not necessarily going to get the same story wherever we look. It depends where we look. That story will be determined partly by where we're looking. That doesn't mean to say that these things are happening in isolation from each other, you know, and that what we end up with is just a series of very local studies. You know, what was the colonial impact on the growth of Bombay? What was the growth on Lahore? There are common trends. You know, we've seen this in these presentations with the influence of John Lockwood Kipling and his sort of influences in two very different settings. So that there's a need, I suppose. What I'm trying to say ultimately, there's a need to hold in tension two things. One, a comparative dimension, which is important, and two, the particular. You know, and if you can hold those two things in tension, I think that that's important, you know, in terms of perhaps looking at this new research agenda of the urban and the environment. And it's hopefully one of the things which I think will come out in the other papers, you know, as we go forward, and from the volume, you know, is this tension between particular and comparative universal trends. I don't know if anyone else from the panel would want to add to that, or what they think about that approach.
I think I agree with Professor Talbot that these cities, as we all know, historically the trajectory has been different of Mumbai and Lahore and so on, and yet you know, even in the brief talk that we all have given, you know, there are common threads which are emerging. So I think we need to explore them. As you said, with regard to Kipling, in your own talk about post-partition and the slums and what's happening in the nation, is again a common thing which we could look at. And coming to Patrick Geddes, I think he was in fact the first professor of the Department of Sociology in the, I don't know how many know about it, in the University of Bombay in 1919. So it would be you know, nice to sort of go into what the kind of work he has done, and his you know, from what we know about his ideas on build structures and urban planning and what the reality was. So definitely, I think we would like to, you know, go deeper into.
And of course, Geddes did visit Lahore, you know, and had some influence, I think, you know, in terms of urban development planning in Lahore as well. So there's that connection.
Right. Sure.
And one thing that I would like to add here to whatever Ian was saying, that with reference to the famous book Making Lahore Modern, by Ian, I'm forgetting the name of that gentleman.
Bill Grover.
I'm trying to think. Gosh. He's based in the States, isn't he?
So is that Bill Grover you're talking about?
Yeah, Grover.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, when it comes to modernism, you know, modernism as a feature of those urban spaces. There is a classificatory method, and there is, you know, not only you classify, but you standardize also. So standardization and classification, if you see all those towns and cities within northern India, not talking of Mumbai, because it is a different setting. It was commercial. It was conceived as a city. Mumbai was conceived as like Karachi was conceived as a city. But Lahore probably was not conceived as a city. It grew into a city. So in these North Indian districts and cities, you know, there had been a standardized pattern, like, you know, the center of a city is a civil line, where deputy commissioner's office exists, where town hall exists, where degree college exists, where hospital exists, and then all, you know, the bureaucratic circle living in and around that area of civil lines, and then there are separate quarters for the natives, you know, and that existed, and that still continuing that trend. All those new districts that had come up in Punjab, Pakistani Punjab, you know, the pattern continues. So not only it's a legacy, but despite being classificatory pattern, there's a standardization. So standardization is a very, very important aspect to it. That's what I think, you know. So despite the fact that um, we emphasize on the particular, the general is far too conspicuous. You know, is more conspicuous than the particular.
Just want to add, although we are running out of time, that in many ways, like the typical city like Pune, which has an earlier medieval past, where you see the, you know, like, or Solapur and these areas, the civil lines, police lines, cantonment and all. Mumbai is not seeing that trajectory because it flows from the Seven Islands. So I think just want to mention that. And again, the neatness, again, when it comes to the mills, what happens is, although in central Mumbai, the textile mills are built, it doesn't become a separated, you know, only mill area, because the working classes prefer to live next to the mills in these chawls. So therefore, you know, there's the neighborhoods where they live and the mills are all in the same area. So that is very much a feature, as you also said. Next to the high rises, there are slums. So I find it quite interesting. Yes, Preeti, yeah.
It's been a fascinating conversation. Sorry, we are over. We took 10 extra minutes because clearly it was fun to talk about this. I'll hand it back over to Winnie to continue the next session. But thank you, three of you. This is really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and Dr. Mishra. Now we've come to the end of panel 1.